a rocket scientist, a man who has built space satellites, and he's going to come and share where he sees future new age technologies offering an investment opportunity. He's come over from San Francisco from Shasta Ventures, Rob Coneybeer.
Well, Danny and the Becco team, thanks a lot for having me here today. It's really exciting to be here to talk about something that I spend a lot of time thinking about as a venture capitalist, and that's the future. And when you think about the future, in general, counterintuitively, it's good to start with the past and what's happened in the past. And the history of technology is actually, it's quite simple. If you look at the history of technology in Silicon Valley, you can break it down into some basic technologies that led to these platforms that came along. You started with the mainframes, and this is back in the 50s and 60s, and it led to the emergence of IBM, and it was when the United States and Russia were competing with each other to put a man on the moon. And they were also using those mainframes to calculate ballistic trajectories to shoot at each other. But things became a little more sane. The PC wave came along, and that led to some very interesting companies being created, Microsoft and Dell and others. And then you had the internet wave, which we're all quite familiar with, and then most recently, the smartphone wave. And when you look at these waves, what's particularly interesting about each of these waves is that with the mainframes, it was a small number of users. It was probably tens of thousands of people that used mainframes when those were in the heyday, maybe 100,000 or so. And then the PC came along, and that was the personal computer, and that's where it started to reach millions of people and tens of millions of people. And then next up, you had the internet come along, and we had the boom and the bust, but it led to hundreds of millions of people coming online. And then most recently, over the last decade, the rise of the smartphone. It's hard to believe that the iPhone is only about 10 years old. And each time each of these waves came along, you had more and more and more people coming into each of these waves, and you had bigger and bigger and bigger companies being created. You can see each of these waves. You had companies like Cisco when the personal computer came along and led to the rise of the internet. You have companies more recently that ride on the availability of ubiquitous connectivity and computing that you have in the smartphone, GPS that you have in the smartphone, Uber, Airbnb, and then Facebook. I'm sure nobody's checking Facebook right now, but you could. It would be very, very easy for you to do. So what's next? This is the thing that we ask ourselves all the time at Shasta Ventures. What's coming next? And when you take a look at this, we think that it's actually quite instructive to start with the smartphone, to start with the recent past, and to take the smartphone and to take it apart and look at the parts of the smartphone, what's in it. When you look at the smartphone, you can see a battery here, and you can see where the camera holes are. You have these sensors, you have GPS built in, you have computation. You have the computation that mainframes, all the mainframes in the world had 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in a single smartphone. And this is stuff that everybody in here knows. We've seen this. We've seen what's in here. The memory that's in here. All of the world's information is accessible through these components. And when we look at these components, we break them down into 4 basic technology areas. This is very helpful for thinking about how it comes together. You have computation and storage. We're all familiar with that. Each time a new iPhone comes out, each time a new Android device comes out, it's faster, it's more powerful, it can store more and more information. And then the other thing that people don't think about quite as much is the sensors. You have cameras, you have GPS, you know location. You have the microphone, which is what supports the different voice services like Alexa and Siri. But the thing that's not quite as obvious is when you look at these things, you have the energy storage that's in there. You have these batteries that are incredibly slim, but they do allow this incredibly powerful device to actually operate, for the most part, all day long. And then you have materials. You have the ability to drop a phone repeatedly, which none of us wants to do. And yes, we've had cracked screens, but it's nothing like the fragility that you had with screens in the past. So all these technologies are moving very, very quickly. Now, what's also interesting is when you look at this, there are 4 basic categories. And oddly, that's a lot like the 4 proteins that you have in DNA, the building blocks of life. So when we take a look at the future of technology, we look at this and we're inspired by evolution. It really sets the stage for evolution. And looking forward, it's pretty straightforward to look at what's coming next by looking at what came before us. And in particular here, you have all these components and technologies that are right in front of every one of us right now, and they're coming together in new ways. And these are all things that we see in our daily lives today, and we can see how they're permeating our lives, and they go from being just a few billion people using it to everybody in the world using it. And in fact, going beyond just having one phone for every person, you're going to have 2, 3, 4, 10 devices that work for you, whether it's a learning thermostat from Nest, which has AI built in. You have augmented reality and VR that allows you to actually have an overlay in the real world. It's a form of computation. You have self-driving cars. I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago that we'd be thinking these cars are right around the corner, that they're starting to happen, cars that can drive themselves. All of these things are based on the same core technologies as the smartphone. You have drones, and then you have robotics. And Boston Dynamics is one of these companies that's doing amazing things. You've probably seen the videos where you see the dog come up and help another dog and open the door, or you see the human go up the stairs or leap or do different things. Unfortunately, and perhaps terrifyingly, it's a bit like the Terminator, but this stuff is coming. It's here. It's right in front of us right now. So I want to talk to you a bit about a market, an enormous market that rides these same waves that you probably don't think a lot about, but it's part of your daily life. Every person in this room is a part of this market on a daily basis, and it's a lot like an iceberg. It's a $350 billion market today, according to Morgan Stanley, and it's probably not what you expect. It's actually the space industry. And when you look at the space industry today, you have communications. These are big geostationary spacecraft. They are out at geostationary orbit, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. You have GPS. GPS is 4 different constellations. You have the American constellation, that's the Global Positioning System. You have the Russian constellation, that's called GLONASS. You have the Europeans close to finishing their own, that's called Galileo. And then you have the Indians and the Chinese are close to doing their own for a whole variety of strategic reasons. This is hundreds of millions, billions and billions of dollars have gone into building out these constellations that we take for granted. They're there on a daily basis. And this isn't including military applications, communications applications, things that are all done today. So the reason that we don't hear about it is there are some very significant roadblocks. And I would guess that anybody in this room, when you think of rockets, except for Becco's rocket, you think of explosions on the launch pad. This was an explosion that happened about 3 years ago, 3 years ago. It happened on Wallops Island in Virginia. You might not think of Virginia as a launch site, but it's a significant commercial launch site in the United States. And it was carrying about 50 small satellites, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And it's hard. It's very hard to do this. You have to get things going very fast. When you look at a rocket, there's an equation. It's called the rocket equation. And then they have what's called the mass fraction. And that mass fraction is enormous rocket, tiny payload, because it's very difficult to get into space. And then once you get into space, it is this unbelievably foreign environment. There's no air. And when you're in direct contact with the sun, or you're looking at the sun, and you have radiation effects, it degrades all the semiconductors, all these technologies we were talking about. And then you also have this impact of heat. So you know how you feel when you walk in the shade behind a tree, and then you come out? Now imagine being outside the atmosphere, and you have a satellite that's going around the Earth, and it's going from sunshine to what's called eclipse. You go from the equivalent of plus, say, 100, 200 degrees Celsius down to minus 270 degrees Celsius in a blink, absolutely quickly. So it's incredibly difficult to do. So you're probably wondering why I have a picture of a school bus here. And when you look at these two things today, This is the first analogy to understand how technologies have evolved to a point. There are three specific things that are unlocking commercial space today. So what's a $350 billion market is about to become a multi-trillion-dollar market because the applications are so interesting. Number one, when you take a look at the satellites that were launched about 30 years ago, they were about the size of a school bus. So that's whether you want to do communications from one part of the globe to another, whether you wanted to take pictures of things that were on the surface of the Earth, whether you wanted to do basic science, you had to build something the size of a school bus. Now, those same capabilities are available in something the size of a toaster or even a shoebox. And you go forward about another 5 years, that same capability is going to be the size of a Rubik's Cube, which means it's incredibly less expensive to build this satellite. And when you think about these rockets, you don't have to lift as much weight into space. So the cost per unit of capability, it's different than unit mass, but unit of capability is coming down very, very, very rapidly. Now, the second thing, I show you a picture here. I'm going to give you a quick, very quick primer on orbital mechanics. There's really two orbits that you need to think about. So if you're thinking about space and why it's interesting, there's only two things to think about. There's low Earth orbit, LEO, and it's very, very close to the surface of the Earth. It is just above the atmosphere. It's only about 150 miles up. And that's much closer than any of the regional plane flights you're going to take if you were able to go straight up. And then you have geostationary orbit, and this is the orbit that is tens of thousands of miles out there, and it has one major feature, which is why people used it primarily for space for decades, which is one orbit is completed in the amount of time it takes for the Earth to spin. So when you have it at the equator, it looks like it's in the same place in the sky every moment of the day. So it turns out that was a great place to put these big school buses, but you had to have a big school bus because it was so far out from the Earth. So when you have a delay and you talk to somebody in another continent before you had fiber optics, you'd say something and then you'd talk over each other because you were waiting for the signal to go out and bounce off a geostationary spacecraft and come back. Now, the reason that I point this out is there are a few things that are fantastic about low Earth orbit, and there was one major drawback. The things that are great about low Earth orbit is it doesn't take anywhere near as much energy in the rocket to get it into space. That's number one. Number two, when you're only about 150 miles up, you're still protected by the magnetosphere of the Earth. So you don't have to do as much radiation shielding, so you can use off-the-shelf components. It's a huge advantage. It's part of the reason you can build the spacecraft smaller and smaller. And then the other thing that's great is if you're up there and you're taking pictures of things that are on the ground, or you're communicating from point to point, you don't have to wait so long. It's only about 150 miles away. And the big drawback, and the reason that people didn't use it before, is because it's so close to the surface of the Earth, you have to build what's called a constellation of dozens, if not hundreds of satellites to be able to cover the surface of the Earth because you're so close to it that at any given point that you're in the sky, you could only see for a few hundred, maybe a couple hundred miles around you. So computation allows you to connect all these devices and for them to be able to communicate with the ground. Now, the third thing I wanted to point out is launch itself is becoming more and more reliable. It's becoming cheaper. And this is a SpaceX, it's a Falcon 9 rocket, and the number 63 is the number of launches that they have had to date. And I think a lot of people don't realize that this number is coming up to close to 100. And each of these launches is roughly $60 million apiece with really good margins for SpaceX. Another thing that people don't realize. So you're talking about billions of dollars that they have realized in revenue for launch today. Each time it goes up, it's launching a school bus. It's not launching smaller satellites, and we'll get back to that. So when you look at these things, it comes to this, what I would call formula for new space. Why is new space interesting today? And there are the three things we talked about. One is all these smartphone technologies are directly attributable to building smaller spacecraft with the same capabilities it took a school bus. Two, low Earth orbit, you don't have to go as far, and it has all sorts of advantages. And then third, you have reliable launch. and inexpensive launch. It's coming down very quickly. So we've reached an economic tipping point, a huge economic tipping point, and we're seeing it with the startup activity. I have met with hundreds of companies that are doing interesting things in space. I was in the space industry 30 years ago, and it wasn't until about 4 or 5 years ago that the interesting startups started to come along. So when you look at this, you say, what are the opportunities? Okay, space is nice. We've seen the space station. We've seen the things that people do in space. Why do we care? What are these opportunities? There's 4 major opportunities that we see and we're looking at today. One is what's called Earth observation. And this is where you're basically taking pictures of what's on the ground. And there are a lot of different things you can do with that. You can use what's called hyperspectral imaging, and that's where you can look and you can see what's below the surface of the Earth. You can take regular pictures to see what's going on. You can use synthetic aperture radar, which will see through clouds. There are all these technologies to be able to monitor what's going on every square meter of the Earth. And then you have communications, and this is the killer application. And because everything's getting cheaper, constellations are getting built that allow people to communicate from one point to another on the globe at prices per bit and per unit connectivity that are actually becoming increasingly competitive with traditional networks. Now, the 2 areas on the right are a little further out, but they're not as far out as you would think. One is manufacturing, another is tourism. I'm sure everybody in this room has seen all the stuff with Richard Branson working on what he's doing, and you have others talking about how they're going to take people to space. That's absolutely going to happen. But we're starting to see manufacturing opportunities that people hadn't thought about before, where being in zero gravity allows you to do interesting things in terms of pharmaceuticals, fiber optic design, and other areas, things that are extremely compact, extremely high value. And when you start to have regular reusable capsules like the Dragon capsule from SpaceX, you can actually start to build a business here. And we're looking at these things, and we're seeing these companies. So I'm going to show 4 quick examples. These examples are over in what we think are the near-term things, where you have communications and you have Earth observation. One is called Spire. And the basic applications of Spire are ship and airplane tracking. So when you have that Emirates flight that's going up over the North Pole and you want to know where it actually is, the lemur, or the constellation of 60 lemurs that are out there, are actually able to track the signals off those planes and relay them back. And this satellite is a satellite that is roughly the size of the toaster. This is one of those toaster-sized spacecraft. There are 60 satellites currently in operation. The company has raised about $140 million, and it's not going to need a lot more money to get to cash flow break even. This is a company that we're a seed investor in, and we invested in about 5 years ago. There's another company that people may have heard of, used to be called Planet Labs, now it's called Planet because marketing. And you can see the size of the spacecraft here. They call these spacecraft the Doves. And they have 150 spacecraft currently in operation. I think a lot of people aren't aware of the scale of some of these startups. The fact that they're able to do this for just $183 million is pretty mind-boggling. And what they do is they do Earth imaging. And the idea is, by having this pervasive constellation of 150 satellites, they're able to take pictures of every part of the Earth on a daily basis. And then they're able to apply machine learning algorithms and CNNs and other things to be able to see where are the changes happening on the surface of the Earth, and then you start to create value out of it. So this is another example. One company that we're particularly excited about is called Vector Launch Systems. And what they are doing is they're building small rockets. And this is a rocket that can be launched from anywhere in the world. It doesn't need your traditional launch architecture. This rail that you see here can be transported on a trailer. They don't need Cape Canaveral. They don't need to be out of Wallops Island or other locations. They just basically need a square concrete pad to launch 100 to 200 kilograms, several of these toasters, into outer space for just about $2 to $4 million a launch. This is happening now. They have their first orbital launch coming up early next year. And the company has raised over $100 million. They have enough money, again, to get to launch, and it won't be that much more money to get to cash flow break even. There's a long backlog of companies that are interested in their launch capacity. And then the final one that I wanted to mention here is called Accion Systems. This one is at a pretty early stage right now. They've raised less than $20 million. What they're focused on is how do you move a satellite around after you get it into outer space? How do you do that very efficiently? Because when you think about the rocket, and you go back to what I talked about, the mass fraction being very small, the amount of payload that you get into space is very limited. So you want to have thrusters for moving the satellite around in space or pointing it in space to be incredibly efficient. And what Accion is doing is they're using, it'll sound sophisticated, electrospray ion engines, but it's really a fancy phrase for electric propulsion. And what they're able to do is, if you take a look at this grid here, it's a very simple grid, that device is about the size of a sugar cube. It's actually quite small, so that's about 4 sugar cubes together. And then it has a propellant tank on it that's about the size of an inkjet cartridge. That's all the bigger it is. And they apply electricity across this in a proprietary way, and they take the equivalent of what you would see as your inkjet fluid, and they accelerate it out of it at a massive velocity. And by doing that, most of that energy comes from the sun. It comes from the solar arrays on your spacecraft. So you can make it very efficient, and then what you do with this is they can make it in volume. It doesn't look like a traditional rocket. It doesn't look like that traditional housing that you see with things that can explode. And if you take this and you put thousands of them in parallel on a panel that might be the size of a flat screen TV, you can scale up the thrust that you have. And then if one of them fails, it's not that big a deal. It's kind of like that irritating pixel that you see that occasionally fails on a screen. All you do is you deal with that sort of failure in software. So I want to leave you with this thought. And these final thoughts are, one, this is happening right now. And as part of that, it's within reach today for venture capital, which means it's right at the cusp of coming into the mainstream. It's not something we see every day, but it's something that's part of our everyday lives. Number two, unlike clean tech, people look at this and they go, isn't it like clean tech? Or isn't it like an area where it's not that, that it's capital intensive, et cetera? You have to remember, every time you think about space, you have to remember it is a Moore's Law opportunity. Every year that goes by, every 4 years that goes by, these things become 3x more attractive from an economic point of view because all the processors, everything are impacting it. And then finally, as you look at it and people are saying, where are the applications? Today they're in communications and Earth observation, but very soon we're going to hear more and more about ordinary people going into space, things being built in space. It's happening now. So, thank you very much. Thanks.
Want to take questions? Inspiring, exciting, amazing. We have time for a couple of questions before a coffee break, so if you have something to ask, just raise your hand, and a microphone will be launched by our space system over here.
That's good.
Tell us very briefly who you are.
Hey, my name's Danny. I'm actually in the blockchain space, so I'm no way, by any means, any sort of space expert. But what it seems you're saying is that the real goal that you're trying to solve is to send something up into space really efficiently, so to make rockets really cheap. What about a space elevator? Where are we with that?
Yeah, so for people that aren't familiar with the idea of a space elevator, it's no joke. It's like having an enormous rope that goes up into outer space. And the reason that it works is you would have, this will sound wild, it's like out of science fiction, you would have an asteroid at the end of it, and because it's attached to the Earth and the Earth is actually spinning, you would actually have a taut rope that goes up. So the physics actually would work. It'll happen. The issue is that the materials that we have today can't handle the strain that you would have to do that. So the idea of building that space elevator that you could actually run something up and down to get into outer space, that's probably hundreds of years out until we can get to where the materials can actually handle what the physics dictate for that material to be able to handle.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes.
Yes, all of this is extremely interesting, but my concern is really, aren't you creating a congestion in space? I mean, from the 350 billion market, you're launching tremendous amount of hardware.
Yeah, so it's one of the questions. It's a good question. It's a question a lot of people ask is space starting to get congested? And the reality with space, there's a couple things. One great feature that I did not mention about low Earth orbit, besides it being close to the Earth, is that it's still in the upper atmosphere. So there's still a tiny bit of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere there. What that means is if you're in that orbit and you're not constantly boosting that orbit, those spacecraft fall out of the sky. So low Earth orbit actually cleans itself up pretty quickly. And then the second one, to maybe use a local analogy, is if I had a catapult and I wanted to catapult some toasters towards our friends in Oman, and I did it from, say, 10 different locations along the Emirates, I don't think I would need to worry about, even if I was shooting 100 or 1,000 toasters on a trajectory for fun, them hitting into each other in the sky. And space is a much, much, much bigger place when you look at it. So when you start to look at the desert and you see what's out there, and then you start to think about space and the way that the physics work, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The bigger issue and the congestion that people think about today is actually around radio frequency spectrum. So when you look at geostationary orbit, which we were talking about, they break it into, I think it's about 360 pieces to go with the 360 degrees. And in each orbital slot, you have, I think it's the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, designates who's allowed to use which spectrum in which orbital slot so that they don't interfere with each other. So it's really much more of a spectrum reuse congestion than physical debris. It's still real, but it's not as significant as people would think.
I think, Rob, we have to break for a coffee break.
Okay, great.
Because we're running a little bit late. So thank you very much. Everybody,
Okay.
have a break.
Thank you.